Breaking news. Governments are corrupt. They lie to their people, steal from their people, and occasionally kill them. As Americans, we tend to believe this about other governments, but rarely, if ever, our own. One of the most glaring examples of just such violations of American constitutional principles occurred during the height of the Cold War under the moniker MKUltra. It was perhaps the most famous of the CIA mind control programs that engaged 80 institutions, including universities, hospitals, prisons, foundations, and pharmaceutical companies. The experiments were conducted on unwitting US citizens, sometimes leading to permanent mental damage and even death. But here's the kicker. When the operation was finally exposed by Congress in the 1970s, the CIA had already destroyed the vast majority of the documentation on what they had actually done.
The senators seemed unimpressed. Perhaps it was because they already knew too much. Each senator arriving with a fat, orange-colored notebook crammed with classified material about the CIA, all marked top secret.
Basically, a lot of this MKUltra stuff, a lot of the experiments were initially done in concentration camps, like at Dachau and Auschwitz during World War II. And so we happened to get quite a few of these doctors and scientists in the United States to kind of help solidify these mind control programs, as well as programs involving chemical, biological warfare. In 1995, I believe, there was a presidential committee hearing that was headed by a psychiatrist from New Orleans. Her name was Valerie Wolf.
As a therapist for the past 22 years, I have specialized in treating victims and perpetrators of trauma and their families. When word got out that I was appearing at this hearing, nearly 40 therapists across the country, and I had about a week and a half to prepare, contacted me to talk about clients who had reported being subjects in radiation and mind control experiments. The consistency of people's stories about the purpose of the mind control and pain induction techniques such as electric shock, use of hallucinogens, sensory deprivation, hypnosis, dislocation of limbs, and sexual abuse is remarkable.
And if you go back to the Catholic Inquisition, that obviously similarly very well organized. We don't have exact count, but hundreds of thousands of people burned at the stake, driven by an ideology. It's all in the service of God and so on.
Between the years of 1957 and 1984, I became a pawn in a government scheme. His ultimate goal was mind control and to create the perfect spy, all for the use of chemicals, radiation, drugs, hypnosis, electric shock, isolation in tubs of water, sleep deprivation, brainwashing, verbal, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse.
And that was true. The last witch was burned at the stake in Scotland in 1797. But then what happened was it got secularized, and the authority and the control got transferred to the mental health field. And instead of being witches, these are now a bunch of hysterical women with false memories and false accusations.
To emphasize his point, look no further than the World Federation for Mental Health, whose director at its founding in 1948 was the UK's psychological warfare head, John Rawlings Rees, of the Tavistock Institute in England. Tavistock has a long history of mind control, since its origins in studying shell shock and traumatized World War I veterans. Before taking over the World Federation, Rees had written, "Public life, politics, and industry should all of them be within our, the psychiatrists, sphere of influence. We have done much to infiltrate the various social organizations throughout the country. We have made a useful attack on a number of professions, the teaching profession and the church. I think we must imitate the totalitarians. Let us all, therefore, very secretly be fifth columnists."
It wasn't a theory anymore if mind control existed or research was being done. A lot of people knew that. Point is, it was operational. They were using it, hence the word, operational mind control.
And of course, out here, I was crazy and alone. Nobody knew about this. Nobody believed this. But the closer I got to D.C., the more people knew about it. And you'd meet somebody in D.C. and, "What are you doing here?" And you say, "Well, I'm doing research in the National Technical Information Service and on mind control and hypnosis and drugs and interrogation and various things." Oh, you're talking about erasing people's memories, somebody would say. The guy across the street mowing his lawn over there, he's one of them, you know. So it was like everywhere in Washington.
Walter Bowart became a figure in the 1960s counterculture when he founded the East Village Other, a newspaper that gave voice to Allen Ginsberg, Abby Hoffman, Marshall McLuhan, and Timothy Leary. Leary introduced Bowart to Peggy Mellon Hitchcock, an heiress to the Mellon family, and Billy Mellon Hitchcock, who was bankrolling the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, a mass distributor of Leary's and the CIA's drug of choice, LSD. Bowart soon found himself investigating something that wouldn't be exposed to the public until the 1975 Church Committee.
There appears to be no report by the CIA to higher authority of the existence of these toxins or biological weapons.
Eventually, we start doing the research as he did. He found out that this is far more insidious than he thought because of all the children that were missing. In fact, that this was an inbred, long-term, generational operation where people would actually have children for the mere purposes of donating those children into what he referred to as the cryptocracy. And this was this hidden hand behind the orchestrators and the people that finance this country. The banks, the hidden hand that have been here in the very beginning, that are doing all this, and they're involved with the harvesting of our own children.
I was born in 1956 in a generational Illuminati family.
And tell us, what does that mean? So did your parents talk about this when you were young? They talked about their lineage and what was their belief system?
Their belief system was basically the old religion of Molech, and it's a mind control religion. It's a religion based on ceremonial abuse of children in the programmable state from 1 to 7 years old.
What Jay Parker is describing is often called monarch programming, intended to create dissociative states within traumatized youth. My father inadvertently hinted at it in his film Natural Born Killers.
You know, 1 minute I'm walking with my mother and all of a sudden, chest explodes. She hits the ground, right? And I'm just looking at her. Her forearm flies off, her hip explodes, and I'm not hearing any of these shots, right? Fucking boom! Chest explodes, right?
When asked about Monarch being a sub-project of MKUltra, former CIA Director William Colby is alleged to have said that it was stopped between the late 60s and early 70s, but with no paper trail to prove its existence. I was not surprised by Michael Aquino's response when I asked him about Monarch.
Were you ever familiar with the Monarch project, or so-called Monarch sub-project of MKUltra?
Well, the Monarch program, as far as I'm concerned, is nothing more than an urban myth.
With a background in the CIA's Phoenix program during the Vietnam War, which was centered around assassinations, torture, and psychological black operations, could Aquino be trusted to tell the truth? The producers of the Cook Report certainly didn't seem to think so.
Army investigators here at the Presidio base in San Francisco have now formally accused him of ritually abusing young children from the base's daycare center. Indeed, one young girl says she was horribly abused by both Michael and Lilith Aquino at their nearby home.
A U.S. Army chaplain made an accusation of child molestation centering on us at the Presidio of San Francisco at a time when my wife and I were living 3,000 miles away in Washington, D.C.
But we have a copy of the police report, and the child appears to have identified you.
That's not true.
But as the police report shows, and the Aquinos know full well, the victim of that attack did identify them both as her abusers, to her parents, to her therapist, and to the Army. What's more, since that original disclosure, at least 5 other children have made identical allegations.
Now, it's important to emphasize the fact that Colonel Michael Aquino actually sued the United States Army to take his name off of the Criminal Investigations Division's, CID's list of alleged child molesters from the Presidio scandal. And he lost. Now, what's so interesting is, of course, in 1983, before that period of time, the Virginian County Police were asked to make an inquiry into the leaders of the Temple of Set. And they came up with some surprising facts. Aquino, of course, was an expert in the techniques of psychological warfare, a skill that was to prove useful to him in more ways than one. What happened was it was unveiled, and what I already knew became public knowledge. He held a high-level international security clearance. He was on second mint to NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and he was a member of the World Affairs Council. Now, what happened was the Virginian inquiry uncovered the fact that 12 other leading lights in the Temple of Set were U.S. Army intelligence officers.
Aquino and his fellow intelligence operatives within the Temple of Set demonstrate a clear link between occultism, which means hidden knowledge, and mind war. Isn't that the very essence of magic, to manipulate the mind?
To me, this is where the darkness comes from. This is the CIA's operations, Bluebird, Artichoke, MKUltra. These were cynical manipulations of human consciousness, disregarding any ethical or moral considerations. The idea of probing the human mind, probing the psyche, wiping out memories, replacing them with other memories, hypnotizing people, getting them to take certain types of psychotropic drugs, convincing them to commit, assassinations and then forget all about it, to carry out clandestine operations and then have no memory of it later. The Sorcerer's Apprentice, from Fantasia. All those brooms dancing and then suddenly getting out of control. That to me was what, these programs were like. You're actually causing initiatory states to take place. You're initiating people, but without the safeguards of initiation.
How do you explain to people that this is something that is real in terms of the ritual abuse a victim that basically creates what's called multiple personality or dissociative identity, and how oftentimes these memories can be suppressed and they're not just false memories, essentially, as oftentimes the media labels it.
So how have human beings treated human beings for the last 100,000 years, but particularly the last 100 years? So then it goes straight to Nazi Germany. That's obviously a very organized group of people. They murdered at least 6 million people. They tortured people. It was very systematic. They did all these medical experiments, and including these atrocious medical experiments on children. And these are like regular Caucasian, Western European, civilized people.
I was going to ask you, speaking of Nazi Germany, I heard that you, during your time in the military, I think, conducted a Temple of Set ritual at the Wewelsburg Castle, where Himmler's SS used to have their meetings, right? It was sort of their secret, their headquarters, right? Their secret castle. Is that correct? You conducted a ritual there?
Yes, that would have been in 1982. It's generally referred to as the Wewelsburg working. In fact, most of the SS never came near the Wewelsburg. It was a pet project of Heinrich Himmler's, and it was oriented towards the Grail. It would have been very fascinating to see how that all transpired if, in fact, the SS and Himmler had survived the war and he'd been allowed to continue with it. But then I think you would have seen something dramatically different, a little bit, as I said, more towards the exploration of the human soul from a meditative standpoint than the sort of comic book characters that you normally see of it.
The Grail is mine, and you're going to get it for me.
Shooting me won't get you anywhere.
You know something, Dr. Jones? You're absolutely right.
Heinrich Himmler was studying the black arts and trying to understand more about the effect on the person's mind that is exposed to these blood rituals and sort of thing. What, amazingly enough, Colonel Aquino found out that this was a wonderful trauma base for controlling people's minds.
Aquino's admiration for Himmler, a man devoted to breeding pure Aryan supermen, can be understood by their shared fascination with occultism. Some have argued that the entire structure of Nazism was occult, rooted in myth, secretive hierarchy, and propaganda, mind control. After the war, many of those Nazi doctors, scientists, and intelligence officers were brought to work for the US government. In fact, the godfather of the CIA, and of the MKUltra program, Alan Dulles, personally intervened to make sure Himmler's chief of staff was never prosecuted at Nuremberg.
The tribunal sits in judgment upon 20 leaders of the Nazi Party.
The Nazi conspirators continued espousal and exploitation of this master race doctrine.
With the excuse of fighting a Cold War against communism, the American deep state aped the Nazi tactics.
All over the world, we know, it's well established, the State Department and intelligence agencies engage in theater, and it's what they do, it's spycraft, to create spectacles and events that people may not realize are spectacles and events, but that, well, like the overthrow of Mossadegh in the 50s in Iran. They'll funnel money to protesters, they'll, fly people in to infiltrate protesters, they'll create fake newspapers, and so on.
One story that is continuing to alarm citizens around the country, the mysterious appearance, get this, pile of bricks literally being stationed near the sites where these protests and riots ultimately become. They're staging it.
We know that infiltrators by the police, NYPD, they've been documented, or other police forces, dress up like people they're not and provoke violence. Why is it unthinkable that there might be spectacles that might drive an outcome in the news stream? If laws have made it legal to assassinate American citizens and legal to propagandize them, why should it be crazy or weird to think that that might be for a reason, right? As a journalist, to say these words, I can't tell you with what a heavy heart I say them, but we've entered an era in which it is not crazy to assess news events to see if they're real or not real. And in the United States as well as overseas. And in fact, it's kind of crazy not to.
Okay. Do you think that the U.S. military has a sanctioned program for creating serial killers? Everybody's, oh, come on, ridiculous. Well, wait a minute. What do you think basic training is?
The military.
You take an ordinary guy and turn him into somebody who kills a whole lot of people.
If you ladies leave my island, if you survive recruit training, you will be a weapon. You will be a minister of death praying for war.
There's nothing like mysterious or zombie about that. So that you can train people up to do all kinds of different tasks.
Didn't mommy and daddy show you enough attention when you were a child?
And then when you go to the CIA documents and other documents surrounding this guy, G.H. Esterbrooks, who was a professor at Colgate College in New York, describes in great detail, first published in 1943, last time he published this was 1971, on contract to the War Department in the Second World War, creating Manchurian Candidate, artificial multiple personality, and running them operationally.
I was used in black ops, horrific black ops operations out of the Pentagon and the White House, like under Dick Cheney, under George Bush, under the Clintons.
So talk about how does that program work, essentially? I mean, you could basically, it's almost a type of hypnosis, you could call it, in a sense where you yourself, if given certain triggers, right, whether it was its words or signs or things, that you might actually literally go out into an altered state, or you would check out, you wouldn't be consciously aware of your actions.
Well, when I was sexually abused from birth, I had my brain compartmentalized that memory. Even though I couldn't think to make a judgment on it, my brain compartmentalized that memory. So the compartmentalization of memory that I had was already in place. And they knew that by traumatizing me further, it would create more and more and more compartments in my brain. Within those compartments, whenever trauma occurs, the brain photographically records events surrounding trauma. When a horrific accident occurs and people can go back and see the license tags and whatever. It's the way our brains function, and they know this. So then when they would traumatize me or torture me, and program information in, like a message to a different global leader. And then it was like sealed with a code word or a code theme. And then it was accessed on the other end accordingly. And this was how the groundwork for NAFTA was ultimately put into place. I was used heavily in that for the human trafficking and drug operations.
As you all have discussed earlier, I'm sure there are codes, keys, and triggers that are necessary for someone to know in order to access, very much like getting into a computer program, in order to access the mind of one of these programmed individuals, such as Kathy was. But contained within the pages of this book was much more than codes, keys, and triggers. As a matter of fact, there were very few codes, keys, and triggers in here. What was important, though, were offshore bank account numbers, numbers of persons high up in politics, like Bill Clinton. And at the time that I got this book, Bill Clinton was only running for the office of president.
After 1989, President Bush said, and it's a phrase that I often use myself, that we needed a new world order.
I didn't realize that he had been destined to be placed in that office.
If you look at the bits and pieces of her story, but if you just look at the pictures from Abu Ghraib at Guantanamo Bay, that's enhanced interrogation, but it's the same thing as mind control or brainwashing. So we just, again, sanitized the vocabulary. So yeah, Kathy O'Brien's story is, some of the details are little up there compared to most people's stories in terms of powerful politicians and so on being directly involved with her. But if you subtract off the powerful politicians part, hundreds, thousands of people have described these kind of things.
There's a case in point where back around 1997, when I was living in Olympia, Washington, an MK Ultra survivor from Nebraska contacted me and asked if my wife and I could safe house this woman who was running away from the mob.
You sleazy sons of bitches.
Unless you play ball.
God, you people work just like the mob. Yeah, there's no difference.
And the mob was very much into this type of MK Ultra type programming. And I guess they had a deal with the government where they could sort of like timeshare these individuals because, you know, they were multifaceted. They could do a number of things. They could do drug running, prostitution, assassinations. So my wife and I actually helped this one woman, and this woman was allegedly involved in an assassination of Luis Donaldo Colosio, who was the presidential candidate of Mexico in 1994. And she had no memory the day before, the day of, the day after. But she has a lot of facts about what happened. And she has no idea why she has all this information stored in her head. It was just such a crazy time because we had all this surveillance around our house, cars parked in front, the dreaded black helicopters going over our house, hovering over to the house. So our house was shaking, and actual spotlights sometimes even coming onto our house. Basically, we're just saying that, you know, we're here.
Now, for those having a hard time believing mob bosses and government officials share presidential models or sex kittens, remember Marilyn.
Mr. President, the late Marilyn Monroe.
Happy birthday, Mr. President.
She may not have worked as a spy, but she took secrets about the government and mafia conspiring to assassinate Castro to the grave. And that was before the CIA colluded with mobsters to smuggle heroin from the Golden Triangle during the Vietnam era. In the 80s, you could still expose these kinds of things on mainstream news, shows like Morton Downey Jr.'s.
When you brought up the fact that you were going in to see General Kun Sa, and that he indeed had been shipping and is shipping 1,200 tons of heroin every year into the United States of America. And we had an opportunity to make a deal, we turned it down. Is that right?
That's exactly it, Ward. It was most disturbing to me because we didn't go to see Kun Sa about drugs. We went in cooperation with the White House. Tom Harvey, a would-be Ollie North lookalike, was the NSC staffer that asked us to go. It was to find prisoners of war that reportedly Kun Sa was holding. When we got there, we found out that he had no prisoners, but we couldn't leave without asking him why he insisted on shipping this poison into the world. And Kunsa said that the U.S. had been his best customer for more than 20 years. Well, I didn't believe it. This was December of 1986. He said that he was willing to stop 900 tons in 1987, and then he said, I will disclose every U.S. government official that I have dealt with in the last 20 years.
The CIA was so heavily involved in CIA cocaine ops that they finally, the people demanded something be done, and finally they investigated themselves to find out they weren't involved. But nevertheless, they were.
Now it is alleged the CIA also helped the Contras raise money for arms by introducing crack cocaine into California. It is an appalling charge. It is an appalling charge that goes to the heart of this country. It is a charge that cannot go unanswered. It says that the CIA, an agency of the United States government, founded to protect Americans, helped introduce drugs and poison into our children and helped kill their future. No one who heads a government agency, not myself or anyone else, can let such an allegation stand.
I will tell you, Director Deutsch, as a former Los Angeles police narcotics detective, that the agency has dealt drugs throughout this country for a long time. I was personally exposed to CIA operations and recruited by CIA personnel who attempted to recruit me in the late 70s to become involved in protecting agency drug operations in this country.
But secret knowledge equals power. And again, that's going right back into the whole occultism and MK Ultra mind control basis and philosophy. The handful of criminals implementing the New World Order. So we're taking over the drug industry worldwide and the drug wars. And that was being used to fund the New World Order. That and human trafficking.